Welcome to another episode of the Family Futures podcast series, Pondering Pods. If you have a topic you'd like to know more about, you can email us with your suggestion at contact@familyfutures.co.uk. We are talking about the ASGSF, which is an absolute nightmare acronym if you're dyslexic like me to say, previously known as the ASF. It's the Adoption Special Guardianship Support Fund. I am with Stephen Mulley, Therapy Services Manager, creative arts therapist. Hello. Dance therapist?
Dance and movement psychotherapist. That's what I am by trade.
Yeah. And we're going to be talking about the ASGSF.
We are.
Who's eligible, what it is, what it means, doing a bit of signposting, and just providing some more kind of general information for people, because something we have noticed is quite a few of our families either come to us and don't know what it is, or people would like more information, and we just thought it'd be a helpful thing to discuss, didn't we?
Absolutely. And I think you're right. It's a funny sort of ever-changing beast, really, and I think it can be quite difficult to get your head around, because I think there's certain grey areas in it as well. So I'm certainly not an expert on it. I think I probably know a bit more about it than your sort of average Joe on the street. But I'm so yes, I'm not going to be claiming to be a world expert at it. So, we will get where we get to today, I think. But
okay. Well, you know a bit more than me, so quite a bit more than me about it. So you can explain to me. So who's it for, first of all?
Well, let me take you back a little bit further than that. So the ASGSF, as you say, it was previously just the ASF. And interestingly, it was always available for children and young people who were adopted, but also under special guardianship. But they've added the SG to the name because it was often not very well known that people and children and young people under a special guardianship order were eligible for it. So they've sort of shoehorned it into the name, which I think is helpful. But like you say, it doesn't roll off the tongue quite as easily. But it was an initiative by the government a few years ago, and essentially it's a sort of centralised or central government pot of money, which is ring-fenced and specifically for children and young people who have been adopted, are under a special guardianship order, and there's a few. What I do quite often when I'm unsure. Go on.
Yeah, no, it's kinship care families as well, I believe.
It is. It's actually, and I always recommend going to just the government website, the gov.uk website on this. If you just search up ASGSF, it's the first one to come up. And actually it's quite clear and quite helpful. So it's a fund that is, it's for specialist assessments and it's for treatment packages. And so I'll get onto that a bit more in a minute. Those who are eligible for it. Okay, so I'm going to read the list because it's quite a few, and there's some real subtleties to it. So it's available for children and young people up to and including the age of 21. But, and we're going to come back to this, if they have an EHCP, so that's if they have an education, health and care plan, they are able to access the ASGSF until they're 25. Which is a really important distinction. It's for children and young people who are living and being placed with a family in England while waiting for adoption, or who have already been adopted from local authority care in England, Wales, Scotland or Northern Ireland, but live in England. So that's another sort of crucial thing, is the ASGSF is for people living in England. Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland have got different pots of money and different ways of funding things. So but it means it also covers children and young people who have been adopted from abroad and live in England with a recognised adoption status, for children and young people who were in care before an SGO was made, or left care under a special guardianship order that was subsequently changed to an adoption order, or vice versa. People who are under residency order or child arrangement order, that's a CAO, and were previously looked after. And children and young people who were previously looked after, but where the adoption, special guardianship, residency or CAO placement has broken down, irrespective of any reconciliation plans. So in some ways it's quite broad.
Yeah. And we will put the relevant links to the pages we're discussing in the caption to the podcast, because I'm aware that we're kind of reading stuff out, and it's helpful to have a link thrown in there for people to have a look and kind of go through in there under their own steam.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and it's fairly clear. I think there are some nuances to it that can sometimes cause some difficulties. But, it's a sort of fairly it's a fairly big umbrella sort of pot of money that covers adopted kids, special guardianship kids, kinship care, children in residential care, all that sort of stuff.
And the reason we know so much about it, or you know so much about it, is because most of our families come through the ASF or are funded in some way by the ASGSF.
Absolutely. So, as you say, I think the majority of families that we see through the complex trauma service, the majority of them receive funding from the ASGSF for their assessments with us and their treatment packages with us. So we spend a lot of time talking about this pot of money.
So you mentioned it's for support or specialist intervention, and assessments. Can you talk a bit more about what that means?
Yeah. So again, so there's different levels to it. So basically, anyone who comes under that eligibility criteria is can apply for what's called the fair access limit, and that's something that is available to everyone who's eligible for the fund. And that's £2,500 in a year for a specialist assessment. So so I don't know, if you've got two assessments that cost £600 each, then you can have both of those. I think that's right. I'll have to go and check that. But it's basically £2,500 a year. So you can't do one assessment that's £2,000 and then another one in the same year. You have to wait for the next year, if that makes sense. But so £2,500 for specialist assessments per year. And then the fair access limit covers any treatments and interventions up to £5,000 per year.
And every child is entitled to that. Child and young person is entitled to that.
Yeah.
And it's every year, right? So it's a rolling.
Yeah. Rolling funding. But it does have to be reapplied for every year.
Okay.
So it's not something that just rolls over into the next year. Whatever is being received has to be reapplied for each year.
Okay. And it's the local authority of the family of the child who...
Yes and no. Again, this is another sort of slight area of complication. So around the same time? Yeah, around the same time that the ASGSF was introduced, was around the same time as the regionalisation of post-adoption support services.
Yeah.
So now, generally speaking, it's the regional adoption agency teams that make applications to the ASGSF. So particularly if it's just for the fair access limit. So if you're asking for an assessment that costs less than £2,500, the social worker at your regional adoption agency can just apply directly to the ASGSF for that, and it just goes between those two organisations, those two teams.
Okay.
The complication comes when there's this thing called match funding. So the fair access limit, that can all just go directly through the regional adoption agency.
So you don't. So sorry, just for the fair access limit, you don't have to qualify for that. So you're entitled to support no matter what.
Yes.
A family who's eligible for the ASGSF. And whereas for the match funding, it's for specific
I mean,
needs.
Even fair access limit applications, there still has to be justification for it, right?
Yeah, of course.
The ASGSF, it's not a sort of cash machine. There still has to be some thinking about it and some thinking about what's available, why this assessment is needed. Yeah, and it should be absolutely focused on the needs of the child and the family. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's one thing. But so match funding then becomes slightly more complicated. So match funding is a process where if a child or a young person needs a treatment intervention that costs more than the fair access limit, then the social workers or the team around that family and that child can apply for match funding. So this is where the ASGSF commits to matching whatever funding a local authority puts in. Okay. So if you have something, a package of care that costs £20,000, for example, the local authority would put in £10,000, and that would be matched by the ASGSF with their £10,000. So for anything above the fair access limit, it halves the sort of financial burden on the local authority.
Okay.
Does that make sense so far?
Yes.
Great.
Yes, it does.
The complication comes though. So where with the fair access limit, the regional adoption agency social worker can just apply straight to the ASGSF, and that just all gets signed off with their teams and their managers, and through their panels, their funding panels. If match funding is needed, then it has to go through the local authority as well, because that match funding money is half coming from the ASGSF, but half of it is coming from the local authority.
Okay. Yeah.
So I don't know. Yeah, your sort of borough is different to the region, the adoption region. So then, like I say, that just adds a layer of complication, because if the regional adoption agency social worker, for example, is making the match funding application, they will have to go through their funding process and their management process and decision process. Once they've agreed it, it then has to go to a local authority social worker and social work management team and go through the local authority funding panel.
Okay.
And then once that's done, then it goes to the ASF, and the ASF check it all out, and they, in theory, agree to match fund what the local authority have said that they will put forward. Okay. So that's where some of the complications can happen, because it can feel quite bureaucratic in those moments. Now, of course, local authorities can do that without a regional adoption agency, and of course, not all areas come under the regions. Most of the country does, but not entirely the whole country. But local authorities can do that themselves. It's just that often, because the specialist adoption and SGO sort of knowledge and expertise is now within the regions. The local authority children's social care teams are often dealing with everything else they're dealing with. So it can...
We don't have the adoption team anymore sat within
the local authority.
Within the local authority in the same way, yeah.
So that can just, like I say, it can just feel a bit complicated at times, because suddenly there's another layer in there, and completely understandably, you know, often local authority social work teams or children's social care teams don't know about the ASGSF because they're not dealing with these families. System. No, exactly. But the match funding thing is amazing. You know, we have a lot of families who come through who apply for match funding and are given it from their local authorities and the ASGSF. So yes, we have a lot of dealings with match funding, and of course, you know, again, it's reasonable sums of money that the local authority and the ASGSF are putting forward. So again, you know, it has to be a robust application. There has to be, good reasons for it, and it has to be based on the needs of the child and family.
Yeah, and that's why before you can apply for the 5K fair access limit or match funding, you have to have the specialist assessment of need, because you can't just
absolutely
approach them and say, okay, we would like X, Y, and Z, and it's going to cost this much. That's why you have the report and the assessment.
Yeah.
And thinking about the assessment, so on the government website, it's called a specialist assessment. It's obviously something we offer. Other agencies or similar to us offer specialists. What makes it a specialist assessment?
Great question. Well, I think because depending on their sort of staffing levels and their teams and stuff, maybe all of it, but I certainly know some of the regional adoption agencies can provide those as well. So they can apply for that fair access limit for an assessment that they do. I guess what makes us a specialist assessment particularly is, you know, at Family Futures, we've got our own model. We specialise in working with children and families with complex trauma and developmental trauma. It's our sort of bread and butter. And the assessment process that we have developed over the years is a multidisciplinary, holistic, sort of wraparound assessment that looks at and specialises in developmental trauma, child development, and all that sort of stuff.
Sorry. Yeah.
No, I was going to say, so I guess part of it is because we are a specialist agency, and therefore we do specialist assessments.
And, you know, you're applying, you know, if you're a parent or a carer or a special guardian, you're applying for your child or young person, you're supporting them through the application, but the specialist assessment is looking at the family as a whole, because with our families that come through to us, it's not just the child that comes in for the support, it's the family as a group, and that might include like individual sessions just with the child or young person. It might include parent support with the parent or family sessions.
Yeah, absolutely. Whenever we do an assessment, we know that this child or this young person that's coming to see us, or children or young people, they don't exist in isolation. So yes, we certainly look at their individual needs and individual difficulties, individual strengths, but we also know that their parents, their carers, their guardians, the adults around them, their siblings, those family systems, they are also crucial to this child's healing, development, and recovery from whatever the trauma was that they suffered. And so we will always be looking at family dynamics, child-to-parent relationships, parent-to-child relationships. We'll look at dynamics between couples. We'll look at, or carers, sibling relationships. We often comment on the sibling relationships as well and the dynamics that go on there. We think about birth families. We think about experiences in foster care. We, all sorts of things. So, yeah, it's our assessments are certainly not just sort of getting a child or young person in and looking at them as if they're broken and thinking, how do we fix this this broken child? But it's looking at the whole system around them, and thinking, how does all this interact, and what are all the relationships like, and how are those part of this child's journey and story as they grow and change and get older.
And with the families, I mean, we are obviously just talking about the families that kind of come through our doors and that we speak with, but how can they be supported to access it? I know we talked about the regions, but if you're a family and you're wondering, is this something we know we're eligible, but do we need it? Do we, times are hard, but what's the measure?
Yeah, great question. I mean, like I say, my first advice would be to have a look on the website. And there's various things online, and there's different websites that have various bits of information and the sorts of things that you can get through this fund. So if you're sort of thinking, I feel like we need something, but I'm not sure what, see what's out there online. Also, you're very welcome to give us a call. We can always chat to you about it. We can, one of the therapy team is, we
have our advice line.
We do, well, yeah, and, can always give us a call. I'd also recommend if you're not already in touch with your regional adoption agency, get in touch with them and have a chat with them. You can search who they are. If you don't have a regional adoption agency, then contact your local authority and just start talking to them about it. I've also found in the past, I have ended up calling the ASGSF for advice, and you can just call them and get advice, and they've been very helpful in the past. Yeah.
Oh, amazing. Yeah, that's good to know.
But the website's got quite a lot of stuff on there. But call us, call them, call the region, call the local authority, start digging into it. Because it can be really helpful, because I think a lot of the conversations we have, because the service we offer is the equivalent of a sort of CAMS tier 3 or 4. So it's service. So it's, it's quite highly specialised. It's intensive work, and it's always longer term work. So for interventions like that, the ASGSF is crucial, because the needs of the children and young people that we have coming through our door are usually such that local services perhaps don't have the resources, or don't have the expertise, or can't react in the time frame that this child or young person needs. So yeah, this fund is really crucial for that sort of for this sort of work.
And I guess, I mean, you're talking about the sort of higher level, more kind of in crisis, so the CTS service, complex trauma service, sort of explains it, but also families who are not in crisis but know they need support. They don't necessarily need to come to us, but they can approach, like you said, you have to be referred by a regional or local authority. You can't self-refer to the ASGSF.
Yeah, correct.
But you can approach your region, your local authority,
Hmm.
ask their advice. They do
Yeah,
an assessment of need of you,
yeah,
of your
absolutely.
family.
And lots of regions have, I think all of them
Smaller,
have in-house
yeah.
teams as well who, because the ASGSF, it can fund direct work with children and young people, but it can also fund parent support, for example.
Mm,
Um, so if you're a parent or a carer, and I mean, commonly parents and carers who come through our doors are socially isolated. When you've got a traumatized kid in front of you, often you end up being quite isolated. Your
mm,
social networks disappear, or it's hard to keep up with people, or it feels that people don't understand, all that sort of stuff. So the ASGSF can also cover things like parent support, parent advice, some group work,
yeah.
interventions that are out there, all sorts of things. So there's quite a lot of flexibility within it.
Mm. So also, as well, what you're saying is also if you're a parent or carer, to feel you can access
Yeah,
the ASGSF for support for yourself.
yeah, yeah. As a parent, yeah, absolutely, or a
Yeah.
carer, yeah, yeah, and that's, I think that's really important because sometimes
Mm,
it's often felt that there's only stuff for the kids, and the parents and carers need a bit of support as well. Absolutely,
yeah.
and I think you're right. It might not be high level stuff that you need.
Yeah.
It might be just a bit of support here and there, or some shorter term therapeutic interventions.
Mm,
And lots of people offer lots of different programs, and interventions and therapies, at lots of different levels. It's
yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I think it's for our family, certainly it's a really important thing to have.
Yeah.
And there's various sort of, I mean, it has its limitations, right? For example, there's some funny rules like, a child has to have been in local authority care at some point. So even if that's just for one night, um, but that becomes tricky sometimes because if a child has, um, been with a birth parent and then moves in with an aunt who
Mm.
then gets an SGO order, so then
Oh,
never
so then they don't.
they don't qualify. I think I'm right in saying that, but
Okay.
which is a sort of
Feel
odd. I
free
don't
to
know
fact
whether.
check the website, anyone listening.
Feel free. And I suspect that was probably an oversight when it was done, but it's a complicated. And also,
Yeah.
I think another thing that strikes me as, odd about it is that if you get into university, you are
Mm.
no longer eligible for it.
No.
Yeah. So and I get it. I think it's because, um, it's relying on existing student support structures within universities, but from my experiences, those
And
are
it's
quite
specialist
variable.
support
Yeah.
working with children who've experienced trauma.
Yeah, it
Okay.
can be
Mm.
variable. So if I were, that's one thing that I discovered recently, and I was a bit surprised about.
Yeah. That is quite
And
surprising.
yeah, so anyway, but
Mm.
I'll sort of leave that there. I won't get on my high horse about it.
No, let's
Um,
not.
but it is a really valuable resource,
Yeah. And
and
it's
it is.
important to be aware that you can access it at any point.
Hmm.
There is a limit, as you say, apparently the university thing. There is an age limit of 21 or 25, as we mentioned, with the EHCPs or special
Hmm.
educational needs. Um, but also you can access it not just for super high level support,
Absolutely.
and it's a yearly thing.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And because we tend to work really intensively with families.
Mm.
Um, And the model we use is with intensive longer term work, because we know that that's what we specialise in, that's our expertise, and that's the sort of demographic that we expect to be working with. So therefore we know that our interventions, our therapy services, often go above the fair access limit, because we work so intensively with children and families, because we know that that's what's needed, and we know that that's what's effective.
There's the families that we're meeting, and we're having to...
and we know from all our research that that's what makes a positive difference to these children and young people that we work with, and we see really positive results. But we also know that not everyone needs that level of input and support, like you say. And so, you know, this fund is available for everyone who fits that criteria.
And also, you know, through this, we have the families that come through the CTS service, and like you say, it's the more intensive work that we're doing with them. There are some smaller packages, some fair access 5Ks I know as well, but also the permanency and I adopt families that come through our service, the ones where the adoptive parents or parent are assessed and approved by us, and then we collaborate with local authorities to place a child with them. Most of the families come to us for a early intervention, smaller package, because it's that key early intervention that works really, really well in setting families up for success without sounding like some sort of poster.
Yeah, absolutely. But and that's the thing. What we know is all the research shows, as in lots of different areas, but all the research shows that early intervention is the best thing for children and young people who have experienced early years trauma and have experienced moves and family breakdowns and that sort of stuff. You know, early intervention is crucial. And so absolutely, when we work with our adopt families and in our permanency service, we fight to make sure that that is put in place. And we will shout about that, and we will make our voices heard about that, because we know that that's what's needed. And like you say, I think, again, and this is a common story in lots of different areas, but sort of lower level early intervention can prevent or reduce the need for higher level, bigger, intensive pieces of work later. So, you know, it's that sort of spend a little now, save a lot later. If you're thinking terribly cynically from a
thinking
sort of
budget
point
wise,
of view. Yeah, absolutely.
Also, health and well-being.
Yeah, exactly. You know. And early intervention means you can get in there early with the attachment relationships, with the child's mental health, with their mental and emotional well-being. You can get in with parent support, give training, give advice, give guidance, you know, all of that sort of stuff right at the start. And of course that then sets them off on a different trajectory. And that's the crucial thing. I was just looking on the website whilst we were talking. In terms of match, I'm going to circle back around to match funding, if that's all right.
Yeah, let's circle back.
Because I do, it's probably important to say what the official line is for it.
Yes.
So the criteria for match funding, now it's relatively open, which I think is quite helpful. The criteria is a high risk of adoption breakdown without high cost support. Local authorities and regions are dealing with an unusually high number of complex cases that they cannot afford to fund without additional support. Additional funding would help to progress hard to place adoptions. And a lack of available affordable therapeutic support means higher cost provision is required. So there's some reasonably open statements, I think. You know, a high risk of adoption breakdown is an interesting one, because I think that it's a very difficult thing to measure. I know a lot of parents I work with sort of say so to get this match funding, do I have to say to them that we're on the point of placement breakdown? Which of course parents don't want to say.
A horrible place to be in,
yeah. So that one, you know, it leaves it reasonably open, I think, and essentially what all those criteria are saying is either if the needs are really high, or there's not appropriate or eligible, or what's the other word? There's not the right sort of expertise in the local area.
Yeah.
Then you're eligible for match funding. There's a top limit to it, a maximum of 30,000 per child, but you know that should be plenty to keep you going.
Yeah.
There you go. So that's that. But yeah, I think, like you say, I think one of the strengths of the ASGSF is getting it in early in placements, using the funding early, using the fair access limit, getting it in place early, getting the support in early, to set families up in a positive way.
Yeah, and you know, like you said at the beginning, looking as your child, your young person. And looking at what is on offer and what might work for them, and feeling you can say, actually, you know, I think this would work best, or exploring all of the options.
Absolutely.
And as a parent or carer, not feeling afraid to say, I need the support as well.
Absolutely.
Not feeling any shame around that. Yeah.
It's a crucial part of the whole story. You know, it's the old classic, isn't it? But if you're not caring for yourself, it makes it much harder to care for anyone else. And, you know, parenting a child with any sort of difficulties or struggles or additional needs is really stressful. And so a bit of help here and there is absolutely crucial. And, ask for it.
Yeah. Well, let's end on that note.
Well, good.
Thank you so much, Stephen.
You're welcome.
Thanks for being on. I believe next time round we will be talking about, or the next podcast I'll certainly be doing will be on EHCPs, because I know we touched on that at the beginning a couple of times. We kind of mentioned them.
Another, I mean, if you thought the ASGSF was sort of
another mystical, magical acronym.
EHCPs are another ball game, but can be really, really, really helpful. So
really
that would be. And bro. But anyone listening, get in touch if you've got any questions. We're always here. And if we don't know the answer, we usually know someone who does, or we can scurry off and find it. So give us a shout.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Family Futures podcast, why not subscribe or leave us a review? Want to know more about Family Futures? Visit our website www.familyfutures.co.uk. Thanks for listening.